In 67 AD, the most powerful man in the world stood before his court and introduced his new wife. The crowd gasped not in celebration, but in horror. This wasn't a woman at all. This was a teenage boy who had been surgically altered, dressed in imperial robes, and forced to play the role of Rome's dead empress. His name was Sporus, and this is the story of how Emperor Nero turned a human being into a living replacement for his deceased wife. To understand this twisted tale, we must go back to 65 AD. Nero had been emperor for over a decade, initially showing promise as a young ruler interested in arts and public works, but power had begun to corrupt him, and his relationship with his wife Poppaea Sabina had become increasingly volatile. She was pregnant with their second child when the unthinkable happened. During one of their heated arguments, Nero's rage boiled over. In a moment of uncontrolled fury, he kicked his pregnant wife in the abdomen. Within hours, both Poppaea and their unborn child were dead. This single act of violence would haunt Nero and drive him to commit even more horrifying acts in his desperate attempt to undo what he had done. Grief and guilt consumed Nero completely. He couldn't accept that Poppaea was gone forever. Desperate to bring her back in any way possible, he began searching throughout the empire for anyone who could replace her. Then, in the busy streets of Rome, his advisors found him, a young freedman named Sporus. The resemblance was uncanny. Sporus had the same delicate bone structure, the same height, even similar eyes, but Nero saw something more than resemblance in his delusional state. He believed he had found a way to resurrect his dead wife. This wasn't going to be simple role-playing or theatrical performance. Nero was planning something far more sinister and permanent. The emperor's plan was methodical and chilling. He would transform Sporus completely, erasing every trace of his masculine identity and rebuilding him as a perfect replica of Poppaea. Nero convinced himself that if the transformation was complete enough, he could somehow bring his wife back from the dead. The boy would undergo surgical procedures that were both primitive and brutal by modern standards. Court physicians, operating under the emperor's direct orders, performed irreversible procedures to alter Sporus's body. The details of these operations remain unclear in historical records, but ancient sources suggest they were extensive and traumatic. What followed was a systematic erasure of Sporus's identity that lasted months. The physical transformation was only the beginning. Teams of imperial servants worked daily to teach him feminine mannerisms, speech patterns, and behaviors. He was forced to learn how to walk in flowing robes, how to gesture gracefully, how to modulate his voice to match Poppaea's remembered tones. Every aspect of his former self was methodically stripped away and replaced. The psychological manipulation was equally devastating. Sporus was isolated from anyone who had known him before, surrounded only by people who addressed him as Augusta, the title reserved for the emperor's wife. He was dressed in Poppaea's actual clothing and jewelry, forced to sleep in her former chambers, and required to participate in daily rituals that had once been hers. Court artists painted portraits of him in imperial regalia, and these images were distributed throughout the empire as official representations of the empress. The training extended to intimate details of Poppaea's personality and preferences. Sporus was coached on her favorite foods, her religious practices, even her personal habits and expressions. Servants who had once served the real Poppaea were brought in to ensure authenticity in every detail. The goal was complete psychological replacement. Nero wanted to believe, and wanted everyone around him to believe, that his wife had somehow returned. But perhaps most disturbing was how the imperial court gradually began to participate in this elaborate delusion. Senators, advisors, and foreign dignitaries were expected to treat Sporus exactly as they would have treated the real empress. They bowed to him, sought his counsel on matters of state, and addressed him with the formal honors due to an imperial wife. The entire machinery of Roman government became complicit in maintaining Nero's fantasy. In 67 AD, Nero made his delusion official. He married Sporus in a lavish ceremony that shocked even the jaded Roman aristocracy. The wedding was conducted with all the traditional rituals and pageantry of an imperial marriage. Sporus, now permanently transformed and addressed as the new Augusta, stood beside Nero as thousands watched in stunned silence. Ancient historians recorded that the ceremony was both magnificent and horrifying, a perfect representation of Roman imperial power at its most decadent and cruel. The marriage wasn't merely ceremonial. Sporus was expected to fulfill all the public duties of an empress. He appeared at state functions, received foreign ambassadors, and participated in religious ceremonies. The imperial household operated as if nothing unusual had occurred. Official documents referred to the empress, coins were minted bearing his image, and the Roman calendar included celebrations of the imperial couple's happiness. But behind the elaborate facade, the psychological toll was devastating. Court observers noted that Sporus rarely spoke unless directly addressed, and when he did, his responses seemed rehearsed and hollow. The vibrant young freedman who had once walked Rome's streets had been replaced by a living statue, beautiful but empty. Every day brought new performances, new requirements to maintain the illusion that Poppaea had somehow returned from the dead. The most tragic aspect was how completely Sporus had become trapped in this role. He couldn't simply remove the costume and return to his former life. The physical changes were permanent. His former identity had been erased from official records, and everyone who had known him before was either dead, exiled, or forbidden from acknowledging his true past. He had become a prisoner of his own transformed appearance. Nero's reign was rapidly collapsing. Military revolts erupted across the empire as generals and provincial governors refused to accept his increasingly erratic leadership. The Roman Senate, long cowed by imperial power, finally began to organize resistance. As news reached Rome that multiple armies were marching on the capital, Nero realized his time was up. In June 68 AD, facing certain capture, torture, and execution, he chose suicide instead. But Sporus's nightmare didn't end with Nero's death. The young man who had been transformed into an empress found himself in an impossible position. He couldn't return to his former life. That person no longer existed in any legal or social sense. Instead, he became a valuable political symbol, a living reminder of Nero's excesses that various factions wanted to control or eliminate. Otto, one of the competing claimants to the imperial throne, took possession of Sporus and kept him as a companion. When Otto was defeated and killed in battle, Sporus was passed to yet another powerful man. Each transfer was a reminder that he had become property rather than a persona, collectible artifact of imperial decadence. The boy who had once been a free citizen of Rome was now trapped in a cycle of possession and display, valued not for his own humanity but for what he represented to others. The political symbolism was complex and cruel. Some used Sporus as evidence of Nero's madness and moral corruption, while others saw him as a fascinating curiosity. But no one seemed to consider what he might want for himself or whether he retained any agency over his own fate. After years of being passed between powerful men like a valuable object, Sporus finally found a way to reclaim control over his own existence. When the Emperor Vitellius announced plans to use him in a public spectacle, forcing him to play the role of a raped maiden in a gladiatorial show, Sporus had reached his breaking point. The ultimate humiliation would be performed in front of thousands of Roman citizens for their entertainment. Rather than endure this final degradation, Sporus chose to end his life on his own terms. Historical accounts suggest he took poison, dying quietly and alone. After years of being forced to perform femininity, forced to embody someone else's identity, forced to serve as a political symbol, this final act was entirely his own choice. In a world where he had been denied agency over every aspect of his existence, death became his only remaining form of self-determination. The tragedy of Sporus extends beyond his individual suffering. His story represents the ultimate expression of imperial power's capacity for cruelty, the ability to completely remake another human being to serve one's own psychological needs. It also highlights the vulnerability of those without political protection in ancient Rome. As a young freedman, Sporus had no family connections, no wealth, and no legal protections that could shield him from imperial caprice. Perhaps most haunting is how completely his original identity was erased. We know almost nothing about who Sporus was before Nero found him. His hopes, dreams, personality, relationships, all of this was systematically destroyed and replaced with an artificial construct designed to comfort a grieving tyrant. The boy he had been was murdered just as surely as if Nero had killed him, physically, leaving only a beautiful shell designed to serve imperial fantasy. The story of Sporus reminds us that behind every historical account of imperial excess were real human beings who paid the price for their rulers' madness. These forgotten victims deserve to be remembered, not just as footnotes to imperial biography, but as individuals whose suffering matters. History is filled with similar untold stories, people whose lives were destroyed by those in power, whose names were erased, whose humanity was denied. What other stories from history do you think deserve to be told? Subscribe to explore more forgotten voices from the past, and let me know in the comments which historical figures you'd like to see remembered. Every story matters, and every voice deserves to be heard.